I'm Becky L. McCoy, and you're listening to Stories of Unfolding Grace, the podcast about good things that happen during really difficult times. I hope that by listening to these stories, you'll feel encouraged and inspired that you can bravely live through hard things too. Today, Ervil LeBaron escaped from a polygamist cult at the age of 13. She had a lot of healing to do, and today we're talking about what it's like to heal from an abusive and traumatic childhood. I am here today with Ervil LeBaron, and she has a book coming out this week, which is super exciting. I got to be on the launch team and read it ahead of time of everyone else, which is like always super exciting. So we won't cover all of her story because it would take a lot more than one podcast episode, but and you can read her book because it's all in there too. So Anna, why don't you share with us kind of the Super Reader's Digest version of your story and what your book is called. We're going to talk about the difficult season because of the story.
Okay. My book is called The Polygamist's Daughter because I was born into and raised in a violent polygamist cult in the late 60s that carried on through the 70s and into the early 80s, and then more things happened in the late 80s that affected my life. And so that's the Super Reader's Digest version.
Yeah, that was actually pretty good.
In like 3 sentences.
Yeah.
I tell the book about life in the cult, what I experienced, how I was able to escape, and then the things that happened in my life after the fact that were all difficult.
Right. So how old were you when you escaped?
I was 13 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And so very young teenage years, very impressionable, very formative years.
Yeah. And you didn't know anything like your worldview was 100% having grown up in this cult.
Correct. So I had no grid for what was going on in the outside world.
Right.
And so the transition was a little bit challenging.
Mm-hmm.
However, I had people along with, God just kind of landed me in a good place where I could thrive in the new environment I was in. Yeah.
So how did you react emotionally to this kind of new life, which, I mean, it's kind of hard to describe the difference between the two because it's like two totally different worlds.
Yes, it was two different worlds. I loved my new life.
Mm-hmm.
Loved it.
Mm-hmm.
However, I was going through the transition was very, very difficult. And I did go through a period of depression in my young teens while I was transitioning out, just because of the changes that happened so quickly.
Yeah.
I recall being really super tired all the time, and I didn't know to call it depression.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to sleep all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I did eventually just naturally come out of that. It took a while, but I did naturally come out of it and, made my way and made the best of my circumstances, even though they were difficult.
Mm-hmm. Did any part of you miss the cult?
No. I was so happy to be out of it.
Yeah, even though that was what was familiar and that you were in like a totally unfamiliar life now.
Correct. I was happy to be out and loved the new life that I had.
Mm-hmm.
Loved the experiences I was having, the people I was surrounded with.
Yeah.
So that made the transition out very a lot easier than if I had not been surrounded by a good group of people.
Yeah, for sure. So once you came out of this depression, Was it like really easy and you were 100% transitioned to like a normal life?
No. My life has never been normal. Can we just start with that?
Right.
I think I had a little brief period of normalcy somewhere tucked in all the weird.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed that while it lasted, and then was sad when it didn't last.
Right. So what do you think some of the challenges have been? Not that you have anything to compare it to, but because you grew up in this incredibly dysfunctional community as an adult, how have you kind of struggled to figure things out where other people might not have issues?
I struggled to figure everything out
Mm-hmm.
because I came into adulthood very ill-equipped to handle life outside of that little tiny community of that little Christian school that we were very sheltered in.
Mm-hmm.
I went from a Mormon polygamist cult to a very small Christian school, very tight, sheltered environment into adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very ill-equipped.
Yeah. And so I want to clarify for people who haven't read your book. So when you say you were in a Mormon cult, we're talking about like extreme fundamentalist LDS.
Yes.
So this is not like if you meet a new Mormon friend, they are like, they're behaving like this. This is something totally different.
It's not mainstream Mormonism.
Right. And then
I'll just say it like this. The modern day LDS church disavowed polygamy in 1890.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was not part of their belief system, practice, all that.
Right.
After
super different.
They were able to make all that stop.
Right.
Eventually. And then the people that wanted to still believe in that, even though the modern day LDS church had disavowed it, became known as the fundamentalists. Mm-hmm. And it's widespread in practice today, fundamentalism.
Right. And then your dad, Ervil, right? Ervil LeBaron, was like the head of your branch of fundamentalism. Okay.
Correct.
And then you went to this small private Christian school that was like, it seems like the people were super loving and genuine and safe, but they were very conservative in that it was kind of like you were in another little bubble.
Yes.
Of not really knowing what the rest of the world was like.
Correct.
Okay.
It was a very small, sheltered environment, and it was very, very traditional. Some people refer to it as fundamentalist Christianity.
Okay. So just trying to paint the picture. All right.
Yeah.
So what did you struggle with most? Not that you can narrow it down. So I'm thinking specifically about you finished high school, you went to this training program, college kind of atmosphere, you went through depression, you finished that program, and you get married shortly thereafter, right?
Yes.
Okay, so in those early years of marriage and having kids, is it like super weird for people to be like, here's your life story?
No.
And know your whole story, and you're like, yeah, okay.
It's a little bit weird, but I was the one who put it out there, so
right, yeah, it's your own fault a little bit. So you had this other really difficult. It seemed like another difficult transition.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about that.
I would say that I did have that severe episode of depression, which I talk about in the book, and I was able to kind of come out of that. So that was very significant and impactful in my life. Yep. And then I did get married to my little high school sweetheart that I met at that little Christian school, and we started life and ended up overseas in Japan because he was in the military. He was in the Marine Corps. So we ended up in Okinawa, Japan, and that's where our first son was born. And then we left there and went to Amarillo and then had 4 more babies. Like boom, 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 boom.
Wow. That's enough to make you like spin, make your head spin.
Yes. So it was while I was in Amarillo that a series of events happened that landed me in a counselor's office.
Mm-hmm.
And walking through that experience with the counselor and doing what she called peeling back the layers of an onion
Mm-hmm.
in order to get to the core issue was it's not funny. I'm laughing not because it's funny, just because it took so long.
I think any of us who have spent a lot of time in counseling totally understand the laugh, because you go in thinking you're going to talk about this one thing, and you end up realizing that it's not about that one thing at all. It's completely different.
Right.
Yeah.
I went to talk about a nightmare that I had that was rooted in everything that had happened in the years prior with my family. And the first question she asks is, tell me about your relationship with your dad.
Oh boy. Yeah. So you're one of how many?
I'm one of 50 children, 50.
Yeah.
Fathered by Ervil LeBaron.
And you spent about a total grand sum of probably hours with your dad, right? Like this, you didn't really have any kind of relationship with your dad.
Right. So when she asked that question, my response was, he was never around and we dealt with it.
Mm.
And, just unemotional, unattached, just flatlined as far as that response is concerned. And I am projecting on my counselor when I think back and say, she was probably sitting there across from me saying, oh, we have a lot of work to do.
And here we go. She's rubbing her hands together. Yeah.
She was so sweet and kind and tender and helpful, like actually real helpful. Yeah. And it took me 5 years of showing up and taking back those layers, one little thin layer at a time, and finally coming to the core. And when I got down to the core, I was just brokenhearted that I didn't get to grow up with a dad.
Yeah.
Brokenhearted.
Yeah.
And I grieved and grieved and grieved in her office, and after leaving her office sometimes.
Right.
Just weeping and sobbing about the grief that finally, everything that had happened in my life, multiple events that were layers of grief, was finally coming up to the surface and finding an expression.
And did that realization, or even before you even realized that was really the root of things, did that brokenheartedness over not having a dad, did that affect your marriage and your mothering and all of that?
Yes. As a matter of fact, because of the way I wrote the book, I did not include a lot of information about my mothering and my marriage, just because it didn't lend itself to the story, to the story arc.
Yep.
And so at the end of the book that's on its way to people right now because Barnes & Noble is shipping.
Yay!
There is a Q&A at the end of the book that actually asks that exact question. How did the way you were raised affect your life as a mother and as a wife?
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, I probably sobbed more writing the answer to that question than I did writing the whole book.
Oh, I believe it, because it's not just about you and you surviving it anymore. Now it's affecting these other people.
Right. There were so many ways that growing up fatherless, growing up without security, growing up without that love and that provision and protection that a father would provide, just set me up for a lifetime of just striving for something that wasn't even there.
Right. And your kind of fatherlessness, like, this is not, if there are single moms listening, this is not saying that your children will have these issues, because you didn't have a father, but you also a lot of the time didn't have your mom either. Like, you were at the drop of a hat moving somewhere different. You literally had no physical or emotional security.
Correct.
at all, ever.
All, ever.
Yeah.
And so basically, the first time I was separated from my mom was when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And then the second time I was 9. And that 9-year-old, that time when I was 9, it was an extended separation for about a year. Those two events combined left me with what I call looking at life through a pair of lenses that for a long time I called them sadness and uncertainty. But with the help of a counselor, I was able to identify that it was really depression and anxiety. So it was
interesting.
It's been a long process, kind of sorting all of that out in my adult life. And while I was busy raising 5 kids, being a wife, trying to make that marriage work, and working, I was working full time eventually outside the home, which was also part of my grief because I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
Well, I was working through all of that and trying to juggle all of that and trying to become healthier emotionally and physically and mentally and, spiritually in all those ways. So,
yeah, it's so much.
I just didn't have a lot of bandwidth for the level of self-care and all of that needed to happen in order to be a really good, healthy role model for my children in that regard. And so all the ways in which I failed them, even though I wanted to be a good mom, had set high aspirations and high standards and high hopes. There were just way too many factors that were coming into play that made it difficult to be the kind of mom I wanted to be. And so I struggled with that for a long time. There was a lot of grief with that disappointment. So I've been in a lot of counseling.
Yeah. Yeah.
The way I see it is if I can be healthy, the healthiest version of myself, then my children are all now grown.
Yep.
And now that they're all grown, I feel like I'm the healthiest I've ever been. But it's like, oh my gosh, is it too late? You feel like it's too late because, okay, they're grown now. So what now? But the truth is, I have really good relationships with my kids. They are sweet and kind and loving and forgiving to me. They've been very supportive of me writing this book and make fun of me. Because I'm so excited about it. Yeah. And it's so contradictory because I'm really excited about this book that is kind of a really heavy topic, a heavy subject. And the story is heavy. And so I always have conflicting feelings when the launch team was getting all their copies in their hands. Yeah. I had very conflicting feelings like, oh, yay! And then, oh, no.
Yeah, I don't know if I really want to be this excited about this story.
This excited for them because they're probably going to be on this roller coaster ride of emotions very shortly.
Yeah.
But yet this has been so exciting because this is a dream come true.
Sometimes when we're listening to people's stories of living bravely, we think, gosh, I could never live that bravely if I had to deal with that kind of a hard thing. But I want to challenge you to rethink what living bravely means. If you're curious how brave you really are, you can take my How Brave Are You quiz. Just head to beckylmccoy.com/quiz. I know you hear this on every podcast you listen to, but it is so helpful if you would subscribe, rate, and review this podcast too. When you subscribe, it means that you get every single new episode without having to search for it. When you rate and review, it helps other people to find the podcast too. So when you're listening to a podcast and you see suggestions for other new podcasts, those lists of suggestions come from the rating and reviewing. So I would really love it and appreciate it if you would take 2 minutes, subscribe, rate, and review Stories of Unfolding Grace. If you're dealing with some really difficult things right now, I want to encourage you to hang in there. I wish I could reach through the speakers and give you a gigantic hug. But since I can't, I wrote the 3 truths and a lie for when life is ridiculously hard. I hope that these reminders and mantras will help you to keep putting one foot in front of the other, and hopefully life will get a little bit easier soon. So we use this definition of grace as being good things that happen during really difficult times. So what have been those points of grace or those good things that have happened?
Well, first of all, my sister Lillian and her husband Mark, they're the ones that took me in when I ran away from home and escaped. So they were definitely included. They're the heroes of my story. Being put in that little Christian school and having that little bubble of an environment to just kind of level out my life. And
like ease back into the real world. Yeah,
ease into the real world in that little quiet environment. You know, my children, my 5 children, even though I had them all one after the other, and, you know, when you're parenting little kids, that's a difficult season. But I wouldn't change anything for any one of them. You know, I love them. I love each one of them. So along the way, I've just had one thing after another begin to set me up for where I'm at now in this season. And it's been several years in a row of things that have happened in the right sequence that I couldn't have predicted and I could not have imagined or put into place for myself. I mean, I've been probably working towards this for the last decade, I would say.
Yeah.
I went and shared my talk publicly for the first time in April of 2007.
Okay.
So I
almost exactly 10 years.
I booked that event in March.
Right.
So it was 10 years ago that I booked my first speaking engagement.
Right. And I think people just don't realize that about books. Like, a book comes out and you think, oh, cool, a book came out. But they don't realize that, like, a quickly published book started 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, never mind the fact that most take
one for decades.
Much more. Right. Yeah. It's really neat that for how, like, truly devastating your story is at moments. Like, and I do not use that word lightly at all. There are moments that are like, I didn't live it and I was still devastated by these different moments. That you can still point and say, like, look at this good thing that happened, and that it didn't. I think about, like, even the relationships with some of your siblings and how deeply you loved each other to get through those really hard years.
My relationship with my siblings is one of those graces. We've had, I've had so many of them that we've been able to reconnect, and all of us are out of that cult that my dad started. It's no longer in existence. It's been disbanded, and everybody's moved on and become, you know, good, kind, loving, productive members of society. So
that's wonderful, because I feel like that's the harder version.
Right.
Like, that's not what could have happened.
Right. Oh, yeah. It could have ended a lot worse and a lot differently. And I mean, not to say that we didn't lose people. We did. There were such tragedies that happened along the way. Just broke everybody's hearts. There's just not a quick and easy route around that kind of grief and that trauma.
That's one thing about the book that I really appreciated, that you were very sensitive in how you shared the trauma, but you still shared it. And it wasn't kind of like, oh, this happened, okay, now moving on, and in the next, but like you really like sat in those moments a little bit. I think those of us who have never experienced a cult kind of, it almost has this romanticized, like a cult is just a dystopia, and it's kind of like that book I read this one time, and
Right.
but it's not like at all. There's no romantic anything about it, and
Right.
you really were very sensitive in how you kind of broke that bubble.
Well, one of the things that I'm hoping to accomplish by writing this book is to humanize the people that were affected so deeply. Their so many lives were just shattered into pieces by the actions and the decisions and choices of one man.
Yeah.
Well, there were many that were involved. It's just hard.
Yeah.
It's very
It totally is.
and
Well, other than being so vulnerable and sharing your story and kind of inviting us into that with you, how have you just chosen to live bravely and authentically as a result of your childhood?
Well, I would say that pursuing healing, pursuing health and wholeness, pursuing freedom, I feel like I have pressed in and pursued those things more than anyone I know. And that took a lot to just bare your soul over and over and over again in hopes of finding this very elusive thing called healing, that magical place where all is there with And I have not found that place yet. I say this over and over again, and that healing is a process. Healing is a miracle.
Yeah.
When you get a cut on your hand, and the next day it's scabbed over, and the next day, a few days later, there's no more scab and your skin has healed itself. That's a miracle. Healing is a miracle, but healing is also a process.
Yeah.
And for me, it's been a lifelong process, a lifelong journey. If I wait until I cross over to the other side and I'm transformed and find myself at the feet of Christ, that's when the healing process will be complete for me. If I have to wait for that, I still have enough now that it makes a difference because I've done the hard work, pressing in and over and over and over and over, knowing there is healing, even a portion of it available to me, and then kind of holding on. I call it having a Jacob's ladder moment where I can see that there's more available to me, more wholeness, more healing, more health. And I say, I will not let go until you bless me. And then just press in and believe that it's possible. And I have done that over and over and over and over again. And it made all the difference. It's made me who I am today. And, one of the things that the publisher, Tyndale, wanted to know and interviewed me extensively is they needed to know that I had healed enough to be able to tell my story without being re-traumatized.
Yeah, and to have people talk about it this often.
and to be able to talk to people like you and just answer questions and show my heart and bare my soul and talk about these matters, the themes of my life that have been so negative and so traumatizing and sometimes overwhelmingly so. These kinds of themes affect everyone's life.
Absolutely.
And so I hope that people who are listening and identifying with any part of this will find hope and courage and press in and ask for help, whether it's professional help or just call a friend or, the neighbor or a trusted, clergyman, pastor, women's minister.
Yeah, whoever it takes. Yeah.
For help. Get the help you need and press in, because that's what I had to do.
So I'm not even really quite sure how to ask you this last question. But the question I usually ask is, what would you say to encourage someone else in a similar situation? But anyone who is in a situation where they're in a cult is probably not listening to this podcast.
You don't know that. You don't know that.
All right. Well, if they are, what would you say to them? And also, what would you say to someone who something that has happened in their life is so deeply affecting their current life? So those two different situations.
So I would characterize what I experienced in that cult as trauma and abuse, all kinds of abuse, not just physical abuse.
Right.
It's psychological abuse, verbal abuse, emotional, spiritual abuse.
Yeah, everything. You're right.
Sexual abuse. I mean, all of those things or any kind of those abuses.
Yeah.
If your life has been affected by any of that or any kind of traumatic event, there's a thing that people can Google. It's called ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there's a little test that you can take that will kind of tell you whether this has been, like, some people don't know that what they're experiencing is called abuse. And so you can go and take that little test, and it will tell you. It will help inform you and give you kind of a starting point. Like, oh, okay, this is what I need help with. This is the area of my life that is not working, and I could use either some professional help with that, or spiritual guidance, or just coffee with a friend where you say, I've never told anyone this. Sometimes it just starts there. And so one of the ways that Brene Brown talks about who to share your story with is she says people have to earn the right to hear our stories.
For sure. Yeah, not everybody is a safe place.
Right. And so fortunately for me, I have found over and over again just the right people that came along. And one of the prayers that I have prayed, very short prayer that I have prayed 100,000 times. And I say what it is, you're going to go, oh, she needs a lot of help.
Or I'm going to say,
So when I have been in a situation where I needed to do something I did not want to do, this is my prayer. I'm willing to be made willing.
That's really good.
And when I've prayed that about whatever the situation was, God just takes that willingness, and I'm going to get all emotional now. He takes that willingness of heart and he tenderly guides, because if you're having to say, I'm willing to be made willing, that means that there's some pretty rough stuff behind that.
Yeah. And it's scary. It can be terrifying.
It's terrifying. It's frightening. It can be scary and overwhelming, or even paralyzing. It's worth it to just whisper that prayer and then see what God does.
Oh, yeah. I've totally prayed that prayer a lot of times. I don't think anybody who's been through really hard stuff and is on that pursuit of healing has not prayed that prayer.
Right.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I know we're recording this before the official book release and festivities and all of that. And that's a crazy week when a book launches. So thank you for giving me a little bit of your time. Before we say goodbye, I'm going to ask you some fun questions just so we can get to know you a little bit better.
Okay.
So the
I'm
first,
game.
Awesome. She in her launch team, she calls herself the cat herder. So like clearly we've got a fun-loving sense of humor here.
Yes.
I call myself that quite often with 2 toddlers in the house. So,
yes. Oh my God.
What are you loving right now?
What am I loving right now? Coffee. Of course, that's not just right now. I'm leading the launch team for Maria Goff's book called Love Lives Here.
Yep.
And my friend Madeline just reminded me today that it was 4 years ago that we were in San Diego at a Storyline conference with Donald Miller.
Yep.
And heard Bob Goff speak for the very first time and bought his book, Love Does.
Yep. And
who could have known that 4 years later I would be launching Maria Goff's book?
That's just so awesome.
Crazy to me and fun. And what's not to love about that?
What is your favorite meal or snack or food?
These days, I'm pretty much surviving on like fruit, nuts, and cheese and coffee, because right now my stove doesn't work.
Oh, boy.
And the part has been ordered to fix it, but it took me a long time to make that phone call and get that done, so I haven't been able to cook. So cheese, fruit, apples.
There you go.
I mean, nuts of all varieties and anything you can put in the microwave, and lots of coffee with cream.
Do you like any particular creamer or just cream?
I like heavy whipping cream in my coffee.
Oh, delicious.
Like no sugar, no sugar. The heavy cream in my coffee, and then we're done. And it doesn't take a lot.
Good. What are you doing to take care of yourself?
Ooh, that is a really great question. Like the other day, I took a long bath, and I don't always take the time for that. I had done a lot of physical activity, and so when I was done with that, yard work and cleaning out the garage and the attic, and
Yeah.
so when I was done with that, I just said "Phooey on the world" and
Yep.
made a bubble bath and got in there and just soaked for hours and read my books, because that's my little escape. Is I love reading.
Yep.
So books are always part of my self-care, taking the time to read, and I just love them. Books are a passion of mine, have been for years and years, and now that I get to launch them, it's even way more fun.
Yeah, super awesome.
So sitting in a bubble bath reading a book is like heaven for me.
Yeah. What are you doing to be brave?
Well,
what are you not doing to be brave?
What am I not doing? I am going to be interviewed in next week, I believe, by a talk show host in Ireland.
Oh, that's cool.
And I got interviewed by a guy from BBC News. That was pretty overwhelming and scary, and took a lot of bravery to show up and be myself. And that was my first interview about this book out of the gate.
Yeah.
With BBC News.
Right.
So anybody that wants to read that can Google BBC Ervil LeBaron.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes so people can read it.
Yeah. And there's an audio in there. So make sure you scroll down to the picture of me. The last picture of me in the article is actually linked to an audio, BBC News Radio version. So
awesome.
Doing this, what I'm doing with you is brave. Just being able to talk and share and, bear that part of your heart that has been inside for a long time.
Well, I appreciate it, and I know that the listeners appreciate it, because like you said before, like, we may not have our stories in common, but the emotional experience tends to be very similar. And it's really, really freeing to hear other people say, this was hard, but I did it.
And then I think two of the most powerful words is when you hear someone share their story and you say, "Me too."
Mm-hmm. Totally.
And then when you are the one sharing and you hear somebody else say "Me too," you just don't feel alone anymore. Mm-hmm. And so that's been a huge part of me putting my story out there. And all the people that have read the advanced copies, I'm getting notes and messages and private messages and text messages of people that have said, "Me too, me too, me too." Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is so gratifying as an author to know that what I wrote affected people's lives for the better.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate it. And everyone, check the show notes because I'll put a link in, but go wherever you buy your books and get your copy or your copy plus copies for other people of The Polygamist Daughter by Anna LeBaron.
I'm going to have a book tour that once I have it mapped out, I'm going to put it online on my website.
Great.
It's not there yet because we're still mapping it out. And so people that want to come by and meet me and get their books autographed, that would be me to meet people.
That would be so awesome. Super awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much, Anna. I'd really love to connect with you. You can find me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, all the things, at Becky L. McCoy. You can also find me on my blog, beckylmccoy.com, and you can sign up to be on my email list. It's a really fun way to connect, and that way you won't miss a single podcast episode or blog post, and you get special ahead of time announcements like new products in the Brave shirt shop. Next week on Stories of Unfolding Grace, I'm talking with Caroline Harries. Over the last few years, she's learned a lot about when your expectations for life go unmet and life looks a lot differently than you had hoped or dreamed, and how she's changed how she looks at life and deals with life on a day-to-day basis. I'm really looking forward to next week.